Mexico has responded to pressure from Trump by sending 10,000 troops to the border. But it's the cartels that control the fentanyl industry, and they're not giving up that easily.
They didn't even see it coming. In the dead of night, 3 armored CJNG trucks, stacked with long guns, encrypted comms, and over 80 kilos of synthetic drugs, rolled confidently through western Mexico. What they didn't know, an elite kill unit had been quietly waiting for weeks. No warnings, no roadblocks, just a trap so precise it left the convoy in burning wreckage by dawn. This wasn't just a takedown, it was a message, and the cartel's response was brutal. The convoy that never made it out. 3 armored vehicles lay destroyed on the edge of the city, surrounded by burned metal, scattered ammunition, and equipment that was never meant to move through civilian streets. What had passed through the area only hours earlier was not a routine criminal movement, but a heavily armed CJNG unit attempting to reposition under cover of darkness. Authorities would later confirm that the men inside the trucks were part of an organized cell, moving between key points in western Mexico. While drugs were present among the cargo, the primary purpose of the convoy was firepower. The weapons, armor, and tactical equipment indicated this was a military-style movement, not a street-level distribution run. This convoy stood apart from previous movements. It traveled with armor, coordination, and equipment that suggested preparation for sustained confrontation rather than a quick transfer. The confidence behind the movement made one thing clear: this was not a shipment meant to pass unnoticed. What made the outcome striking was not only the destruction of the convoy, but how decisively it happened. There were no public warnings, no visible checkpoints, no attempt to redirect the vehicles. Instead, an elite military unit had already been positioned along the route. Surveillance was active, escape routes were mapped, and once the trucks entered the designated area, the operation moved from monitoring to execution. For residents nearby, the night unfolded in bursts of gunfire and uncertainty. For the men inside the convoy, it unfolded far more quickly. The engagement was controlled and deliberate. By the time it ended, the vehicles had been disabled, the convoy neutralized, and the roads sealed. No military personnel were injured during the operation. Mexican authorities did not release specific casualty figures for the cartel members, though reports from the scene indicated multiple fatalities. By morning, military teams were already securing the area, documenting what had been left behind and confirming identities. The scale of the seizure alone made it clear that this was not a chance encounter. The convoy had been carrying weapons capable of causing mass harm, along with communications equipment and supplies meant to support extended operations. News of the ambush spread quickly. For some, it was seen as another chapter in Mexico's long struggle with organized crime. For others, it marked something more serious, a sign that the rules were changing and that certain movements would no longer be tolerated, regardless of timing or location. By morning, as military teams secured the area and cataloged evidence, the scale of what had been intercepted became clear. The convoy had carried weapons, equipment, and supplies far beyond routine criminal operations. What authorities found in the wreckage would explain why this convoy drew such an overwhelming response.
A civil war is raging in North Mexico. 2 factions are vying for control of the Sinaloa cartel, once Mexico's mightiest, now weakened by the conflict.
Why this convoy could not be allowed to move? The operation also raised a larger question. Why this convoy? Cartels move constantly. Vehicles cross territory every night. Yet this particular movement was met with an overwhelming response. Not police units, not routine patrols, but an elite force trained for nighttime operations, urban environments, and high-risk engagements. That level of response is never accidental.
Recently, a video of a phalanx of gunmen proclaiming that the Chapitos faction has allied with the Jalisco New Generation cartel.
It reflects a decision made long before the first shot was fired. A judgment that allowing the convoy to continue would carry consequences greater than stopping it by force. And it suggests that what the trucks were carrying and where they were headed mattered far beyond the stretch of road where they were intercepted. For the government, the operation sent a message about intent and capability. For the cartel, it was a loss they did not anticipate. But the significance of that night does not begin with the ambush itself. It begins earlier, with intelligence assessments, shifting patterns, and a conclusion quietly reached by security planners. This convoy was not intercepted by chance. Long before the trucks reached the edge of the city, Mexican security planners had already determined it could not be allowed to continue. The decision had little to do with the specific road it was traveling or the hour it chose to move. What mattered was what the convoy represented. Intelligence analysts tracking CJNG operations identified a significant change in how the cartel was moving resources in the months before the operation. Vehicle movements became heavier, more organized, and more deliberate.
Suddenly drops down to this. And as you can see, we're the only ones here for miles around. People and drugs have often been smuggled across blind spots in the border.
Convoys were no longer limited to small arms or short-range protection. They began carrying equipment consistent with sustained operations rather than quick strikes. This shift raised immediate concern. Cartels are adaptive by nature, but this pattern suggested something beyond routine criminal logistics. The movements were coordinated across multiple routes. Communications were encrypted. Escort vehicles were positioned to protect key assets rather than individuals. These were not signs of intimidation or showmanship. They were indicators of preparation. What made this movement stand out even more was how it surfaced. CJNG did not announce a new capability through viral videos or public threats, as it had done in the past. There was no display meant to shock rivals or intimidate communities. Instead, the first indications appeared quietly through intercepted communications and surveillance tied to vehicle traffic that did not match known smuggling behavior. The vehicles appeared designed to resemble civilian trucks from a distance while being reinforced to withstand sustained fire. This configuration allowed them to operate in populated areas until confrontation became unavoidable. This was not a platform built for escape. It was configured for endurance. That distinction changed the risk calculation entirely. Security planners concluded that the convoy was not intended to avoid confrontation, but to survive it. The configuration suggested preparation for a prolonged response, not a quick withdrawal. In other words, this was not a movement meant to test boundaries quietly. It was a movement meant to challenge them. Allowing heavily armed convoys to move freely through contested territory risked normalizing a new standard of cartel activity. Each successful movement would reduce the state's ability to intervene later. Every unchecked convoy made the next one harder to stop. For security planners, waiting carried its own danger. Hesitation would signal tolerance, and tolerance in this conflict is something cartels exploit quickly. This is why the response was preemptive. The objective was not to disrupt an attack after it happened, but to prevent one before it could take shape. The decision to act was made quietly and deliberately, without public announcements or visible buildup. Once that determination was reached, the operation moved from analysis to preparation. Surveillance intensified along key corridors. Routes were studied and narrowed. Units with the capability to operate at night and in urban environments were repositioned closer to the likely path of movement. Timelines were refined. Contingencies were planned. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. The convoy continued moving as it had been designed to do. Civilian traffic flowed normally. There were no roadblocks or checkpoints to suggest an imminent intervention, but behind the scenes, options were closing. Every kilometer traveled reduced flexibility. Every turn narrowed escape routes. By the time the trucks approached the area where the operation would unfold, the decision had already been executed on paper. The question was no longer whether to act, but where and when to do so with the least risk to civilians and personnel. This was not about sending a message through spectacle. It was about denying capability. The convoy was allowed to move only until it reached a point where control could be asserted decisively, a place where exits could be sealed, visibility could be managed, and the threat could be neutralized before it reached denser population centers. For the men inside the vehicles, the movement still appeared routine. They did not know their routes had been measured. They did not know their timing had been anticipated. And they did not know that an elite unit had already been positioned to act the moment conditions aligned. By the time the trucks entered the designated zone, the window for retreat had closed. What followed would not be shaped by chance or reaction. It would be shaped by preparation. And by the night of November 26th, every element was in position. The night the trap closed. The operation began shortly before midnight on November 25th, extending into the early morning hours of November 26th. As night settled over the outskirts of the city, an elite military unit moved into final position. The area had been studied for days. Traffic patterns were understood. Entry and exit points were mapped. What remained was timing. For hours, the convoy had been tracked as it moved steadily toward its destination. 3 armored vehicles traveled together, maintaining spacing and discipline. Their route suggested confidence. Nothing about the movement appeared rushed or improvised. By the time the trucks reached the darker stretch of road near the edge of the neighborhood, surveillance teams confirmed what planners had already anticipated. This was the moment. The unit was already in place. The unit's standard operational doctrine for nighttime engagements involves advanced surveillance and observation capabilities, allowing forces to maintain awareness while remaining undetected. Quietly, a perimeter was established, sealing off key roads and limiting every viable exit. The convoy continued forward, entering an area the cartel believed was secure. Once visual confirmation was complete and positions were locked, the operation shifted from observation to execution. The first shots were deliberate and controlled. The objective was not speed, but dominance. Fire was directed to disable vehicles and prevent movement, forcing the convoy to stop before it could scatter or push deeper into residential streets. What followed was a prolonged firefight that unfolded in stages. As the unit advanced, it did so methodically, maintaining pressure while controlling distance and direction. Every movement was coordinated. Communication remained constant. There was no confusion, no panic, and no attempt to rush the outcome. The convoy attempted to respond, but the perimeter held. Escape routes that might have worked in daylight were already closed. Attempts to reposition vehicles were cut off. Within minutes, it became clear the convoy would not break through. The engagement continued for more than 2 hours, as forces systematically cleared the disabled vehicles, secured the expanding perimeter, and ensured no cartel reinforcements could reach the area. Throughout the night, the unit maintained its formation, advancing only when conditions favored control. Operators used cover and elevation, forcing the cartel gunmen into defensive positions they could not sustain. Despite the intensity of the firefight, commanders prioritized containment. The goal was to neutralize the threat without allowing it to spill further into nearby neighborhoods. Every decision was shaped by that constraint. By the time the shooting slowed, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The armored vehicles were disabled. The convoy had been effectively destroyed. Some of the cartel gunmen abandoned their positions and fled into nearby brush, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and the cargo they had been tasked to protect. When the final shots faded, the perimeter remained intact. As dawn approached, additional units moved in to secure the scene. Roads remained closed while the area was cleared, vehicles inspected, and evidence documented. What had been a dark stretch of road hours earlier was now illuminated by floodlights and activity. For residents nearby, the night had been unsettling. Gunfire echoed through areas that had grown accustomed to uncertainty. But unlike many previous incidents, the violence did not spread. It remained contained. That containment was not accidental. It reflected the purpose of the operation itself. The convoy had been stopped at a point where damage could be limited and civilians protected. Had it moved even a short distance further, the risk would have increased significantly. By morning, authorities confirmed that the engagement was part of a broader coordinated strategy to disrupt cartel logistics across the region. What was found in the wreckage? But the significance of the night was not defined only by what was destroyed. It was defined by what remained behind. As evidence teams continued their work, the contents of the wreckage began to tell a clearer story about the convoy's purpose, its affiliations, and the scale of the threat it posed. By daylight, the road no longer looked like a battleground. What remained was evidence. As the area was secured and the perimeter held, military teams began a systematic sweep of the destroyed vehicles and surrounding terrain. Each item was catalogued, photographed, and removed under supervision. What they uncovered quickly confirmed that this convoy was not routine. The weapons alone told a clear story. At least 23 long guns were recovered, according to initial military counts, including a 50 caliber anti-materiel rifle capable of penetrating armored vehicles. Thousands of rounds of ammunition were scattered throughout the vehicles, along with magazines prepared for rapid use. This was not equipment carried for intimidation. It was equipment staged for sustained conflict. Alongside the firearms were tactical communications equipment, body armor, and operational supplies consistent with extended deployments. Tactical vests and protective gear suggested preparation for prolonged exposure rather than brief transit. The most concerning discovery was the volume of material involved. Nearly 80 kilograms of synthetic drugs were found among the wreckage. Authorities did not publicly specify the type. The drugs were packed alongside weapons rather than hidden separately, suggesting the convoy was moving both enforcement capability and revenue-generating cargo at the same time, a combination typically reserved for operations considered strategically important. As identities were confirmed, the picture became clearer. Several of the men involved were linked to a CJNG cell operating under the direction of a senior regional figure known as R1. This individual had been associated with violent activity across the Tierra Caliente region and was known for coordinating armed movements between municipalities. That affiliation explained the convoy's composition. It also explained its destination. The equipment, personnel, and coordination involved pointed toward an effort to reinforce cartel influence in an area where federal pressure had recently increased. The convoy was not simply passing through. It was intended to establish or sustain control. At the same time, parallel operations were unfolding elsewhere. Federal forces conducted additional actions in nearby municipalities, targeting related cells and support networks. Authorities claimed cartel losses across multiple engagements during this period were significant, though comprehensive independent verification was not available. Taken together, these results reflected more than a single tactical success. They pointed to a broader effort to disrupt CJNG logistics before they could consolidate. The evidence also challenged a long-standing pattern. Cartel convoys often operate under the assumption that mobility equals safety, that moving quickly and blending into traffic reduces the chance of engagement. This convoy demonstrated a different approach. It was armored, equipped, and prepared to withstand resistance. That readiness made it more dangerous, and it made the response necessary. As news of the seizure spread, it carried implications beyond the immediate operation. It signaled that heavily armed movements would no longer be treated as background noise in an ongoing conflict. They would be evaluated as potential flashpoints and addressed accordingly. For the cartel, the loss went beyond material. Weapons could be replaced, drugs could be moved again, but the destruction of the convoy exposed vulnerabilities in planning, intelligence, and timing. It showed that movements once considered secure were being observed and mapped long before reaching their destination. For the communities nearby, the operation offered a brief sense of containment. The violence had been intense, but it had not spilled outward. The convoy had been stopped before it could embed itself deeper into residential zones. That outcome mattered in places where civilians often find themselves caught between armed groups. Yet the aftermath also carried a warning. Disrupting cartel operations rarely ends a conflict. It changes its shape. As authorities finalized reports and cleared the area, attention shifted to what would follow. History suggested that losses of this scale rarely go unanswered. When convoys are destroyed and leadership structures disrupted, cartels adapt, they retaliate, they test new methods, and they look for opportunities to reassert control. The convoy had been neutralized, but the consequences of stopping it were only beginning to unfold. What the cartels did next. The destruction of the convoy did not bring calm. Instead, it triggered a response that followed a familiar pattern. When losses mount and territory is threatened, cartels do not retreat quietly. They adapt, escalate, and search for pressure points. In the period following the November operation, authorities reported an increase in attacks and intimidation efforts across the region. Federal forces operating in contested areas faced heightened risk as criminal groups sought to reassert control and demonstrate continued reach. The backlash was not subtle. With CJNG suffering losses across multiple municipalities, Attention shifted toward areas where federal control had recently tightened. Patrols operating in these zones became symbolic targets, not because they were weak, but because they represented authority. While authorities reported increased attacks on military patrols in the region following the convoy's destruction, specific incidents and their direct connection to the operation remained difficult to verify publicly. Security officials acknowledged that retaliation patterns often emerge after significant losses, even when precise causal links are not immediately established. What was clear was the broader escalation. In October and November of that year, Mexican security forces documented multiple incidents involving the use of commercial drones modified to deploy improvised explosive devices, particularly in parts of the Tierra Caliente region. These incidents reflected a growing willingness by cartel groups to introduce aerial threats into ground operations. Drones were used to intimidate communities as much as security forces. Explosives were deployed near roads, structures, and unoccupied areas, sending a message even when casualties were avoided. The intent was not always immediate damage, but psychological pressure. For civilians, the impact was immediate. As violence intensified, displacement followed. Local officials and humanitarian organizations reported significant population movement, with estimates ranging from dozens to hundreds of families forced to leave their homes, businesses, and farmland. Exact figures were difficult to confirm, but the disruption to daily life was undeniable. For federal forces, the escalation reinforced the logic behind the original operation. Cartel convoys entering residential areas with heavy firepower are rarely incidental. These movements are often used to enforce extortion, pressure local producers, or consolidate control over contested zones. Allowing such movements to proceed unchecked risks, normalizing violence rather than containing it. This is why the elite unit involved in the convoy operation had acted decisively. Their training emphasized night operations, urban environments, and containment. The objective was not simply to engage armed groups, but to prevent violence from spreading into civilian spaces. That approach became even more critical as cartels adapted their tactics. Authorities continued applying pressure through targeted operations rather than broad sweeps. Supply routes were disrupted where possible. Mid-level operators were detained. Production sites were identified and dismantled when intelligence allowed. The goal was not to eliminate the cartel overnight, it was to deny momentum. Yet even as these efforts continued, the broader reality remained unchanged. CJNG and rival groups retained influence across significant territory. They continued to adapt, regroup, and probe for opportunities. The convoy's destruction exposed vulnerabilities. For the government, the operation demonstrated capability and intent. It showed that heavily armed movements could be intercepted before reaching their destination, and that elite units could operate with precision even in contested environments. For the cartel, it served as a warning. Routes the cartel had successfully used in previous months were now under surveillance. Timing was no longer predictable, and confidence alone was no longer enough to guarantee movement. But warnings do not end conflicts. They reshape them. As the region absorbed the aftermath of the convoy ambush and the violence that followed, one fact became increasingly clear. The night the convoy was stopped did not close a chapter, it opened one. The convoy never escaped, but the struggle over territory, control, and escalation continued, shifting into forms that were harder to predict and more difficult to contain. And in that uncertainty, both sides prepared for what would come next. The convoy was destroyed on a single road, on a single night, but what it revealed did not disappear with the smoke. It exposed how closely cartel movements are now being watched, how quickly decisions are being made, and how narrow the margin for error has become. This was not the end of a campaign. It was a signal of how it is being fought. And as both sides adapt to what happened in Uruapan, one reality remains. The next move will not come with a warning. If you want to stay ahead for the next story, make sure to subscribe. If this breakdown helped you understand what happened, like the video and share it with others who want deeper context.